I completely agree with Anna, and that how relationships are not something that's one directional or have to be worked on at this level. They kind of have to characterize all of everybody has to be relationship centered at a school, right? It's not just something that's teacher to student, teacher to teacher. It's at all levels with all individuals and staff across the board in order to kind of make this work and hold.
No time, no tools, big expectations. How do you transform school culture without derailing the train? Answer: little wins that bring big changes. The flywheel effect. Harnessing the power of momentum to create a school culture that celebrates change and drives itself.
Hello, welcome. My name is Jordan Pruitt. I'm here with my co-host Anna Murphy, and we're both former educators, now working with the live school team to support your school's culture vision. Our show focuses on all the opportunities for little wins that can create big changes in school culture. So the flywheel effect is all about sharing stories of admin, school support staff, and other educational change agents that have succeeded in their initial lifts and created cultures that have so much momentum they can grow and improve exponentially. Today, we're joined by Dion Burns and Lauren Hernandez from the Learning Policy Institute. Lauren is a former teacher in both traditional public and charter schools in New York City and in Los Angeles. Her work focuses on local, state, federal education policies and their equitable and democratic impact on districts, schools, and communities. Dion is a member of the Deeper Learning team. He conducts quantitative and qualitative research into issues of educational equity and the policies and practices that support the development of deeper learning competencies. I came across Dion through his work on empowered educators. That book was a part of a school administrator training that I was part of called NISL, which is a nationwide training for school admins, what I used to be. In that work, a lot of it was about the different systems of school systems around the world and how they're different, how the career path for teachers is different, how the whole system is a little bit different, but looking for the same aspect of student learning. I thought that was really interesting. That's why I contacted Dion. Thought he'd be a really great addition to the podcast. Would you guys like to say anything else about your research, current work you're doing before we jump in?
I was looking to you first, Dion. You want to talk about LPI and what we do?
Sure. So at Learning Policy Institute, we conduct high-quality research to improve education policy and practice. We work with a range of folks, policymakers, researchers, educators, community groups, and others. And our aim is to advance evidence-based policies that support empowering and equitable learning for each and every child. And we do that in a variety of ways. We have an early learning team. I'm involved with the educator quality, deeper learning, and equitable resource and access teams. And we do a mix of quantitative and qualitative research and look at how we can understand some of the strengths of good practice, what the policy implications for those are, and how we can help transform education.
I think the
Very
only
cool.
thing that I'll add, thank you for that overview. The only thing that I'll add is that one of the umbrellas that I think all of the work at LPI falls under is this desire to make all of these to point to all the evidence-based policies and structures that you can do in schools that really support whole child learning. And so we might talk about deeper learning, we might talk about early education or teacher quality, but it's all with that sort of vision. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about it today with you all today around kind of what the whole child actually means and kind of what that science and research undergirding it is. So that's the umbrella that brings all of the different work that we do together.
Awesome. Yeah. So a lot of our listeners are going to be like school leaders and people, principals, administrators, deans, those kind of folks, and a lot of teachers too. So a lot of times we're going to have principals and admin on here, and sometimes board level folks. But I really thought it'd be really cool to bring you guys on because you guys have a really big lens view, a big macro view of education and in different parts of the world too. So you can really see different changes. I thought that would be kind of cool. Anna, you got anything to add before we jump in?
Guys have just traveled all over to study different school systems, and I'm just kind of like curious, like if you have an experience from that really stands out to you and inspires your work still to this day.
Gosh, well, there's a lot. I think the most inspiring moments for me are when I'm doing qualitative research and I'm visiting school sites. You know, as researchers, we're not in schools every day in the same way that teachers and administrators are. I usually find that the opportunity to speak with teachers, to get them to share some of their wisdom, often accumulated wisdom over 20, 30 years of practice, and they've thought deeply about these issues day to day, and often have distilled it down to a philosophy. I mean, it's really wonderful knowledge that they share, and when you get a chance to speak with them, and they can impart some of that to you, what really works for them, and you get an opportunity to share that. I mean, it's really it's really empowering as a researcher, and just seeing good teaching and good learning taking place in schools. You know it when you see it, when the students are engaged and their faces light up, and that happens all over. It happens in different. It happens in schools, big and small, in places all around the world.
I, I don't think I can say it any better than what Dion just shared. But I just want to underscore that absolutely it's the joy of being in schools. As a former educator, too, I'm so far from it these days in the ways that I used to be engaged. So it really brings me life. It makes me feel young again, also. But just the energy and the joy, not just from the educators as well, but from the young people at different ages, and just the creativity and energy that they're bringing into learning spaces is just really inspiring.
Being able to talk to different educators around the world, I think would probably be really cool. Because I found like even in like within the schools I've worked in, even if you go to different hallways, like because the vibe is a little different, like the different classrooms are a little different because you get kind of siloed because you work in your room all day and you don't really go out a whole lot. So like even just the differences between schools and classrooms and countries and all those things I think are really interesting. But at the end of the day, you're still looking for engagement. You're still looking for students' eyes to light up, and it works everywhere. But if you guys like, we'll go ahead and jump into our second segment here, which is what we call getting the flywheel moving. Um, so our first question is, can you all share one story of a small change you led or observed that deliberately changed the culture of a school? So like that was the goal. And it could be something like from when you were an educator, Laura, or just something you guys have observed since you've been working together.
Um, well, I can lead off. I thought I would share some work we did, some research into an initiative called the Instructional Leadership Corps. Now, this wasn't just about changing, spreading change just in one school, but spreading change across the state of California and different districts around the state. The Instructional Leadership Corps was an initiative of combined initiative of the California Teachers Association, the Stanford Center for Opportunity Policy and Education, and the National Board Resource Center. And the goal was to help teachers shift their practice with the adoption of the new Common Core state standards and the science standards. And the goal was for teachers to create and lead professional learning for their teaching colleagues.
Piggyback on Dion's point there. That's really cool that like on the state level, they were really focused on empowering folks at the local level. Because a lot of times you see change fail because it doesn't go that way. It's just kind of all top down. But like the cultures in buildings, I think it is a lot better when you can have the folks in those buildings presenting and being a part of the change that's happening there. But yeah, go ahead, Laura.
Thanks, Jordan, and apologies. I think there's like a lag on my end, so my timing is off. I also just wanted to piggyback on what Dion was saying about this collaborative approach, and one of the things that I think is really powerful about its ability to, you know, build and foster a positive school culture is the fact that it's relational. And this idea of relationships and people being in dialogue together with one another, learning, communicating, and building connections is often, I think, what we see at LPI in the science of learning and development, which is kind of the scientific base that supports a whole child approach to schooling, really underscores the importance of relationship building as something that catalyzes learning, but also really kind of creates an environment of safety and belonging for all that are all involved, whether humanity is seen in all of those elements that come in that warmth when you walk into a school and are able to engage is something that's really palpable. And while it also sounds like a small thing, right? A relationship, building a relationship with people, but there are very specific techniques that LPI or that we've seen in our research at LPI, structures and practices, for example, that folks can do to really make sure that they're actually saving time to do that, right? It's not just meeting the young folks at the door, for example, or having these collaborative structures, but it's making time for classroom meetings or advisories at the secondary level, or buddy systems for young folks when they're coming into school, maybe as a freshman and want to learn the ropes from maybe a senior or junior, things of that nature. So really thinking thoughtfully about how those connections are made and how folks can be seen and valued, particularly in large schools, is a really important function in terms of moving school culture, which we know then supports student learning and well-being and thriving, right? So it's always in service of that as well.
That's awesome. You've identified like real actionable things you can do because like you said, like that warmth when you walk in, like you kind of get good vibes. It's and you can tell when like a place has got it, they've got it going. You know what I mean? And you can tell when they don't. But it's really hard to put your finger on where they went wrong or where they went right. So it's really cool you guys are looking into those exact things. Which kind of leads us to our next question. Can you share a time when like you saw a change that failed? Like there was a and see if you can identify what went wrong, and that's I think would help our audience a lot because school's about to start and they've got all these things they're going to try to do, and some of them are going to work and some of them aren't. And then we're trying to help them work.
Absolutely. I can jump in on the heels of what I just shared around relationship centered practices and structures. And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot at LPI is, especially through my work through something called the design principles for schools, which is really about translating that science of learning and development, that kind of rich scientific jargony work that was over here in the science and academic realm, but translating it into concrete practices for schools and how they can structure things has been where my head has lived. And a huge part of that has to do with relationship centered practices. And so one of the things that we have grappled with, but also seen in the field in terms of strength and struggles, is how I'll call it, versus failures, because obviously those illuminate areas for improvement. But one of the things that I think that we've seen educators and administrators come up against is this tendency or mindset, or I don't know how it got cultivated in our field, but this idea for us to kind of approach what we're doing with a checklist in mind. This idea that, oh, hey, I do have relationship centered schools because I can go to that checklist and we have advisory. We have block periods where we have young folks with teachers for longer periods. We have restorative practices. All these things that you might be able to check off on the boxes that you have that absolutely are important for creating conditions and opportunities for relationships to be the case. But what that sort of structural checklist mentality and honestly maybe compliance mentality that so many of us have gotten into the habit of being is really that it's sometimes easy to overlook the quality of what's going on within those structures themselves. And so in some of the cases where folks have been more oriented to looking at the checklist and making sure they have structures in place, they have overlooked or neglected some of the things that you need to do with educators to actually make the quality and tenor of the relationship positive. Is it reciprocal? Is it culturally responsive? Things of that nature. And so kind of overlooking that, making sure that you're keeping an eye to all of that and moving against that compliance or checklist mentality is pretty significant. The other one piece, and then I'll see if Dion has anything to add, is that there's also an allure of kind of a one size fits all approach, right? I'll staying in the relationship realm. If you have an advisory, if basically the idea that what you need at your school to make it relationship centered is the same thing across the board is not true, right? It's really about taking stock of where you're strong, where your assets are, where your struggles are within a school, and then thinking about the structures and practices that you can implement and infuse where you are. So it's really not taking what works over here and moving it over here. It's about really holding up a mirror to what's going on at your site and then really thinking, not individually in isolation, but in collective with the folks around you around how to move forward.
I could probably add a couple of comments. One thing about the work we do at Learning Policy Institute is we're looking for places where things are working well, trying to understand the lessons, what we can learn from that, and then share those. But sometimes in that work and talking with educators, we learn a little about things that they've tried. They've had a few false starts with. The Instructional Leadership Corps is an example of that, where each of the Instructional Leadership Corps teams, as they return to their districts to sort of create and lead professional learning, sometimes they had a few false starts getting that going. Sometimes it was because there was some initial skepticism that needed to be overcome, either from colleagues or from district administrators, about what it was they were doing, how it would fit in with professional learning that was already taking place in the district. Um, and But what we found was that as the teachers attuned, they had a few small wins, a few starts, where they attuned the professional into what their colleagues really needed. The reputation of that, where school and district administrators start to hear, hey, this is really effective professional learning for us. The reputation of that led on to more wins and more wins. And in the end, in some of the districts, we saw that the districts were funding this professional learning, sometimes in place of professional learning that they had scheduled previously, because they started to see the value in it. So really, it was, I think, a combination of both a really thoughtful infrastructure on how to establish this initiative by the founding partners, as well as that kind of flywheel effect that you're talking about, that when you get those first small wins, they can help build trust, build those relationships between the teachers and the administrators and the district administrators. And as that trust and relationship develops, then it starts to gather some momentum. I think from other studies, if I just added one more comment, is we where we've looked at change that's taken place in a district, it tends to work better if you can engage the teaching profession with you. So when it comes to, for example, instructional shifts of the standards that we've looked at, announcing it from above, and hoping that that will just take hold because you want to will it into existence that way without generating the investment from the teaching profession. You'll get that again, that checklist, that compliance mentality, but without the deep engagement of teachers. And where teachers have been involved in the change, it tends to take hold a little better.
Yeah, I think both those points work together really well because you kind of get that from when you start up here and kind of point down below. You get that checklist because you even if you're at that position, you're trying to tell them, here's the things you need to do to get it done. So they just do those things, and they don't really apply them to their building and their people and how to get it going. So you don't get the groundswell you're hoping to get. You don't build the trust. Interesting enough, I was a science teacher and a PBIS coach before I was an administrator, and I found that when I wanted to create change, I had a little easier time as a teacher than I did as an administrator because of that. I would talk to other teachers and talk them into it, and then would go from there. But when I was an administrator at first, like when I was just kind of getting started, all right, we're going to do this and this is how you do it, and not as much. You know what I mean? But yeah, that's great. Anna, you got anything to add before we go to the next one?
Back to the relationships then that Laura mentioned, right? As like an administrator, having those strong relationships with the teachers so that when you come with this change, it's more conversational, right? And understanding, and there's that trust that's built in because it's, I mean, we've all been in the classroom. We know how hard it is to make that change, especially if you're not sure if it's going to work out. Like I would just be like, I'm not doing it. I can't. The idea of a class going haywire because I'm trying something new is not going to jive with me. And so having that trust with that admin is really key too. So I think it comes back to like what makes the change work then that you mentioned earlier too.
That I completely agree with Anna, and that how relationships are not something that's one directional or have to be worked on at this level. They kind of have to characterize all of everybody has to be relationship centered at a school, right? It's not just something that's teacher to student, teacher to teacher. It's at all levels with all individuals and staff across the board in order to kind of make this work and hold.
Yeah, it's something you do, but it can't be something you do. It has to be kind of who you are. You know what I mean? So the next piece I was going to ask you guys about, what advice would you give to educators, folks in the field, if they want to improve culture in a way that can scale and be sustained, like out farther than their current role? Like a teacher, how does a teacher impact their school? How does a principal impact their district? How does a superintendent impact their state? And you can pick any of those, but how do you impact a change that can scale farther than where you are now?
I can jump in with that, and I'll stick on the administrator front because I think at LPI we do think a lot about the school level and beyond. So to think about how a leader might be able to cultivate a culture like this in the school, which is no small feat, as we know. And I think the main lesson that we see a lot of the research first of all, it always starts with actually establishing and making it a priority, right? Articulating it, saying it, making it part of the vision, but not just one that's imposed vision, right? Set from the top, from just the administrator's office, but something that can be collectively identified, bought into, developed, even if possible, with students, teachers, families, all of the above. So it's making it a priority and saying it, but it's also making sure it's a stated priority with teeth, right? With not a hollow statement, not something that you are advocating for that doesn't necessarily have any plan of action underneath it. And that's where, of course, with the details of the day-to-day and administrators and the things, everything that you have to do as a school leader on a daily basis, that gets a little difficult, right? How do you make sure that you're dedicating time to one of the things I mentioned before, kind of an assessment, right? And how are you looking at your assets or your needs at a school around relationship-centered schooling, for example? How are you holding space for that on your own schedule, but then in collection with the other stakeholders on the site to be able to actually diagnose them and then think of a plan of how you move forward? How do you do one step at a time? Because it can also feel daunting if you do have a lot of things you need to work on. So how can you do something that feels feasible, that can be bought into? In addition to that, I do the idea that, I mean, kind of building on what Dion's been speaking to, is around professional development and collective and shared learning, and how an administrator makes professional learning targeted and in reinforcing of a shared vision around relationship-centered schools, as an example. And one of the things that I think that we've seen in our research that can really work to make this stick and gain momentum and investment and make believers out of non-believers, right? Even on school sites or beyond, is this idea of engaging educators and practitioners in experiential learning, professional development, where they're literally doing the same practices that they're trying to do with their students, right? Make them the student, make them experience it, make them understand the social, emotional demands of the activity, how it also can build relationships across. Not only does that teach them the techniques of facilitation and implementation when modeled well, right, for them in their own professional learning, but it also just builds their empathy in their practice and brings it forward while also drawing connections. And so that's one of the ways that I think people start to opening their minds and believing, and things can take off as kind of a small piece that administrators can try to do to ignite change.
That idea of experiential learning and practicing what you're going to be doing, I think that's a big deal, because a lot of times we spend a lot of time rolling things out, and you do icebreakers and all this stuff, and you don't really do the thing that you're trying to teach them to do. You know what I mean? So that's a big deal. You're building trust, you're building empathy, all those things. It helps you rolling out any kind of program you're trying to do. That's a big deal. Dion, do you have anything to add there?
I had a couple of things, and I'll make a mention too about that experiential learning, because you reminded me of a really good example of that. I was going to say first, creating those structures for relationships to develop. Laura mentioned collaborative professional learning, which is I think a big one. And one of the studies that we looked at, we call it positive outliers. We looked at districts that were achieving better than expected for their students after accounting for the socioeconomic status of the communities, and had narrower racial achievement gaps than the seen across California. We wanted to understand what was different about these districts. And some of these successful districts, it was creating structures, so professional learning communities for not just at the teacher level. So they had professional learning communities for teachers at the grade level, facilitated by a lead teacher, but then they had professional learning communities for lead teachers together with the principals, and they replicated this up to the district level. So they had professional learning communities of district administrators with 4 or 5 principals undertaking the same kind of inquiry questions, same structure of those professional learning communities all the way up, right through to the sort of district cabinet level. And that created these sort of cross-level linkages between teachers, administrators, and the district. And engage them all in that relationship building and professional learning. But I was going to spark on the idea of this experiential learning for teachers. But one of the more interesting and powerful studies I was involved in was how to create time in schools for professional learning. And initially I was skeptical. I was like, a study of time? We're just going, it was one of the most exciting studies to be part of, because time is the critical resource in schools. How do you organize time to allow for that, those relationships to develop? And I mean, some of the strategies we saw, involved things like PLCs, informal things, lunches, and so forth. But this collaborative professional learning with inquiry time, where a teacher would lead other teachers in the experiential learning of that they wanted their children to engage in. They wanted to experience it from the perspective of the student. I think was really powerful learning for the teachers, as well as building those relationships. So I got to go to a school in Santa Monica, watching teachers doing a science lesson where they're observing the structure of fossils and leaves and shaping it in play, doing that hands-on observation and tactile learning, and seeing teachers get really excited about that and understanding it, replicating the kind of learning that you want your students to engage in, but replicating that for teachers, I think was really powerful.
I really like the idea of time and like how you structure your day. I think that's really cool because like that's where you have a little bit of power as a principal. You know what I mean? You can work with your schedule and you can find ways to do that. Because I found that to be like incredibly like awesome, but also kind of frustrating because you knew that this person down the hall had all this awesome knowledge, but you had the same schedule, so you would never be able to see it in action. You know what I mean? So like being able to create opportunities for that is feels like a not an easy win, but it's a win that can be had. You know what I mean?
The master schedule is a really powerful tool in a school. If you want to really help create the space for these relationships to develop that are really important to transforming school culture and ultimately teaching and learning, uh, how you organize that schedule should reflect the priority that you place on building those relationships. But I'm not going to say that it's an easy thing to do because the places we visited, I talked about how much thought had to go into it, and there are trade-offs in place. There aren't enough hours in the day for everything. How you structure and make best use of that time is critical.
Yeah, and that's one of the things like we do at Live School with our program. And the whole idea is to try to give some time back to teachers. You take some logistics off the table. That's the idea. So we're back with segment three. Be a change maker is what we call this one. Many of our listeners listen not only to scale up the culture in their district, building, or classroom, but they also want to scale themselves up. And they want to be the one that gets that flywheel moving. So in this segment, we're going to give a couple career lifestyle questions based on your background and factors that have contributed your success and allowed you to become an agent of change. So the first question has to do with empowered educators, and what stood out to me was how the teaching profession, how it differs in other parts of the world. Um, from how the career is perceived by the community, how they prepare teachers, teacher career pathways that exist, and the different ways the school day is structured to enhance teacher and teaching effectiveness. We talked a little bit about that last segment. Um, can you expand on a bit on that, and specifically how, like, as a local school leader, how can you take those findings and enhance the teacher effectiveness and teacher retention in your own community?
Well, sure. I mean, I can. Let me start by saying a few things about the empowered educator study and the things that we saw there. Um, this was a study that we conducted in 5 countries. There were Finland. We looked at Shanghai in China, Singapore, then 2 provinces, Ontario and Alberta in Canada, and 2 states, New South Wales and Victoria in Australia. And we had a local researcher and a US-based researcher to work together in each of those. And so we're looking at all of the things that shaped the teaching profession there, from preparation, induction and mentoring, professional learning and career development, and so on. Um, and, and as you mentioned, we found that the teaching profession tends to be more highly regarded in those countries. There's in fact OECD, what's called TALIS data, the Teaching and Learning International Survey data, which finds that the majority of teachers across the OECD, over 90%, are satisfied with their jobs. But when they're asked, do you think that the teaching profession is valued in society, the average is very low. It's down at 26%. But that's not the case. It tends to be a lot higher in the districts, the jurisdictions we looked at. It's over 70% of teachers say that in Singapore, and over 60% in Alberta and Shanghai, for example. Um, And there are a few things we learned about how they shape the teaching profession. There's very high standards to entry into teaching in many of these jurisdictions. The preparation is research based and research informed. So teachers are encouraged to be continual learners and to draw the latest research into their teaching practice and shape it over the career. And then there are career pathways that are well defined in some of these jurisdictions. One of the things that I think is really important is that the attrition rate for teachers tends to be a lot lower in these jurisdictions. For example, it's around 4% in Ontario, and it's similar in Finland and Singapore. Often a large chunk of that is due to retirements. In the United States, the attrition rate from teaching is about double that. It's about 8% that we lose every year from the teaching profession. And so we're continually training teachers to fill those spots. Um, we also know from work from folks like Richard Ingersoll that a lot of that attrition happens in the first 3 years of teachers. So we're losing a lot of teachers before they really get their feet under themselves in the profession and really develop their skills. And so some of and I would say that's amplified now with the sort of COVID-19 pandemic has really highlighted teacher shortages that are being experienced across the country. So there's things that we can learn from that work then about how to reduce attrition. And it comes back to some of the things we've already talked about, the working environment for teachers and that collegial support, those supporting trusting relationships among teachers that are foundational to a more collaborative school culture. Um, some of the things we learned from that study too were opportunities for professional collaboration together, whether it's team teaching, professional learning together, joint activities that combine classes, observing other teachers' classes and giving feedback to other teachers, which is not common in a lot of places. These can all help teaching effectiveness as well as teacher retention. And if I could sneak in some other data there from that comes out of the OECD, because this is an area that I really enjoy looking at. That they find with their studies that professional collaboration is associated with higher job satisfaction, and greater teacher self-efficacy, that confidence in their abilities to be a good teacher. That the feedback that they get from colleagues is well regarded. More than I think it's around 70% of teachers in the most recent OECD Tower survey said that when they receive feedback from colleagues, they find it useful in their teaching practice. And that kind of collaboration puts teachers again at the center of their practice. Um, they also find that those collaborative practices, that teacher collaboration lends itself to the greater use of what we used to call deeper learning practices, right? Giving students tasks that require them to think more critically, have them work in small groups and problem solving, give them more complex tasks that they don't have obvious solutions. And so the creation of that culture, which I think is the kind of work that you're engaged in, those collaborative cultures, think we find from that international work, they can help with the teacher retention side, but they can also help with that teacher effectiveness.
I know you said 8% attrition, but I think it's going to be a lot higher this year and next. I mean, I've seen data like 50% are looking to leave. Obviously, that the process of leaving education takes time then, but this idea of retention and admins right now are sitting down and planning for this next school year, that's top of mind. And so that idea of collaboration, right, and that teacher effectiveness, but also connecting that to teacher efficacy is really interesting, I think.
Yeah, the fact that you found that all those things end up with a happier, healthier, more confident teacher is a big deal. And that's a big deal for us in the whole country, and you can take that back to any building in the country too. If you can create that atmosphere, your school's going to have a leg up. Laura, do you got anything to add there?
I think the only piece that really stands out to me, and I think we're hearing a lot more about it, particularly in light of the teacher shortages exacerbated by the pandemic and the challenges of teaching in classrooms for over the last few years is attention to teacher wellness. I mean, collaborative structures and relationships and connections do create support systems within schools, right? And that are in service of teaching, but also in service of how kind of educators are coming into the space as full humans and what they're engaging with. But I do think that we're seeing increasing attention in some of the schools that we've highlighted in LPI research, actually, that deliberately use some of that professional development time for wellness, whether that's mindfulness practice, if that's your thing, or allowing space for it for those to engage or people to try out. But we've also seen some attention to social and emotional learning, right? Maybe this experiential, going back to it again, right? You're going to be engaging some of your students in social and emotional learning, interpersonal skill development, whatever it may be, but holding space for that sort of attention, self-awareness growing, whatever it may be, at your school for teachers to actually replicate and hold space for so they can continue to develop as their full selves, I think is something that's also helpful for working conditions and allowing teachers to be seen in their fullness, right, in terms of what they're bringing into this space.
Life school, I write a lot about wellness and SEL stuff for students. But we probably don't look at it enough in the terms of teachers and even admin. That's a great point. Go ahead, Dion.
Yeah, I was just going to add a note about the experience for teachers during the COVID-19 pandemic, because we've learned a little bit from our research about that too, just the heavy stress and workloads that teachers have been experiencing over the past 2 years. In some cases, the switch to from online learning, some teachers doing a sort of hybrid teaching where they're teaching part in class and part online. They're having to rewrite lesson plans, create dual lesson plans. The parent contact that's increased where kids are either not able to get online or the all the sort of admin that's gone around that. We found that teachers, some said, when I was a beginning teacher, I used to work these insane hours, but then as I became more experienced, that went away. But during the pandemic, I'm back to doing those very long work days where I work through to night. And so teachers were experiencing more burnout. They've been doing it, I think, tough during these past 2 years. So again, that idea of collegial relationships as being supportive, but also just understanding from colleagues and administrators of how difficult it's been the last 2 years, I think should be kept in mind as we start thinking about transforming school culture and bringing teachers along.
So the next thing I want to ask about, so your research and travels have impacted your outlook on education. Most of us know school from like our own lens, like the schools we were in, the schools we grew up in, the schools we taught in or worked in. So in our cities, districts, buildings. But you guys have a much broader perspective. I'd like to hear what stands out as strong indicators of school culture to you. And like when I say this, I think of kind of some unique things. It's like the schools I've been in and worked in. The thing that like stood out to me is like a strong culture had a lot to do, and some of this is just the places I've been. But if you would go to like events in the evenings, like was there a student section? Were kids there? Were teachers around the community aspect, even like after there? I found like that to be really strong in some places, and then not as much in others. But like, what indicators did you see in other places? That's probably just local to me. But go ahead.
I can start us off. I This is a really interesting question for me. I actually started it with thinking about what my answers would have been as after my time as a teacher, right? Like, what would I think as an educator were those elements or indicators of a strong school culture? And I think my answer back then would have been around something kind of a palpable, real, tangible presence of care and joy. I want to hear laughter. I want to see smiles from a variety of folks. I also, this was the former English teacher in me as well, but I really enjoy walking into a classroom filled with activity and collaboration and productive noise and even productive chaos, dare I say. But also just even thinking about the physical environment and how that's welcoming and what that communicates to folks. So those are some of the answers I would have said when I finished teaching. And what's interesting is that I actually think many of those answers remain now that my time with LPI and some of the work that I've done in really digging into the science of learning and development. So, I mean, I've spoken a lot today around the idea of relationships. And to me, when you have relationship-centered structures in place and you're seeing those kind of interactions of joy and laughter, and even if there's some difficult ones, but there's some really intensive kind of I'm going to communicate with you, I'm going to stay with you, I'm going to believe in you, those sorts of care elements that I think really stand out as an indicator of positive school culture. So I'm looking for those signs still. But in addition to that, a big part of that is having care being communicated through inclusion, right? And identity safety, and really inviting young people's backgrounds and their experiences and their communities and their homes into the school as an asset for learning. Not only to build on their background knowledge that can propel new knowledge development, for example, but also, just how the kind of messages or artifacts or images in a school kind of shows that someone's welcome, show that someone's valued. So to me, that's a big sign of it. And then the last piece of the puzzle that I think the science of learning and develop has really opened my eyes to is this concept of agency, which I wouldn't have been able to name as a teacher. But what it has done for me is really open up my eyes to the ways that schools and relationships are actually trying to let young people and teachers and everyone in them truly blossom, like in their own individual ways. And so it's not just in school culture about being collegial or being kind to one another per se, even though of course you want that. But it's also about how do you let this individual grow in their self-expression, in their independence, and how do you nurture that in empowering ways. And so I'm looking for young people or teachers being able to voice, not just having individuals tell them about a given policy change, for example, but how are you actually bringing them into a conversation, authentically listening to them and helping them inform things. Those are the kind of dynamics, processes that I think are really indicative of a really positive school culture.
One thing you said there, it made me laugh because it's something I say a lot too. You mentioned your English classroom, like being on the brink of chaos. I was a physics teacher, and I always used to say like all the good learning happens like right on the verge of chaos. It could go either way. If it's going really well and like you walk in to observe that room, it's going to look wild. But it's where it's supposed to be, and like that's a good feeling. Like it shouldn't be a really quiet room. You know what I mean? Dion, do you have anything there?
Yeah, I thought I would, uh, you know, uh, share my initial research was at that sort of teacher end of the spectrum, the things I've talked about already. More recently, both as a colleague of folks like Laura and seeing some of the work my colleagues do around school culture and the science of learning and development, it's also informed and helped me learn as a parent. And so I've thought about that lens on my own students, my own kids um, learning. Some of the things that I've seen during research visits to schools is the intentional building of relationships in schools, that social emotional learning in the service of learning. It's for a purpose. It's not just that it's a good thing to do to create a positive culture in the classroom, but as we learn more about the science of learning and development, and this is where Laura is better placed to speak than I am, but we know that it's tied up with the social and emotional and academic all bound together. And so creating those positive relationships and warm environments in classes is in the service of the academic learning as well. That's helped shape me as a parent. So now I look for different things when I'm at school. I know more about the role of emotion and encoding memory, and that my job as a parent is to help my child be emotionally positive and ready for school when they go, and to be able to manage big feelings when they arise, and seeing if there are elements of that in the classroom environment and the way that students and teachers interact. Um, I've also seen that it's possible to share positive practices, that these can spread within a school, and they can spread between schools and between districts, and so that we can be intentional about helping create a strong education system, so that it's not just a case of getting the good teacher in the school or the good school in the district, but these are practices that can go wider, which I think really speaks to kind of the theme of your podcast. And in terms of indicators, I think I look for some of the small things that Laura referenced. there are times where I'm looking for something at a visit to a school, but I'll notice that the adults in the school smile at each other. I think, well, that's interesting. That wasn't what I came here to see, but there's something going on about the environment that they've created in the school. I've seen schools where students don't have a sense of agency or ownership of the classroom. It's the teacher's space, and they only get a chance to experience that, where kids are sort of lined up against the wall and marched in and out of the classroom. And I've seen schools where there are no school bells. The students know when it's outside time, and they look for the sign that the door is open and know that it's time to come in. So that there are these small markers of school culture that I think I've learned to see more now as a parent, I'm learning more from my colleagues about the role of the science of learning and development.
Those are all extraordinarily interesting. I like I've even talked to colleagues about the Nobel theme, and it's interesting. Like your expectations are kind of what they are. You know, I mean, if you create the right culture and expectations, then it can work. And in some places, it may not. But those kind of little changes, different places, are really interesting because it speaks to, like, there had to be a culture in place for the kids to know what to do there. You know what I mean, and it not to be a problem. Anna, what do you got there?
It's creating those expectations then with students, and again, it comes back to that relationship building, I think. So unfortunately, we're almost out of time, which I could go on for hours learning from both of you. So to wrap it up, I had one final question, if that's okay. It's, as admins, this is coming out, mid-summer, early planning time. As admins are listening to this and sitting down to plan for this upcoming school year, what's one piece of advice you would give them then for building that school culture or leading that change in their school?
It's $1 million question. And I think that I think to me there, from the work that I've done, from my even own experience as an educator, all of the above, I think there's something really important about reorienting folks' mindsets around making relationships in our schooling in particular, and all that it encompasses at the teacher level, the family level, which we haven't even spoken about, but also the student level, reorienting the importance of that in the learning process, whether that be through actually engaging folks and learning about why it's important. And there's all these scientific reasons why you can actually point to the fact that relationships improve learning outcomes, well-being. So it's not something that, I think people think of it as a nice to have, and this is a wonderful thing, but they think that it's secondary to academic development. They think that it's secondary, especially in light of, the quote unquote learning loss that so many folks are talking about with regard to the pandemic and how we need to accelerate learning. There's a hecticness around getting back that I think has the potential to continue to put relationship building at the wayside, even though we know how critically important it is, given the isolation and the social emotional challenges we've all faced. And so I think really bring folks in on how kind of the social, emotional, and academic are working together. It's worth spending the time. It's worth taking the time to do it. They always tell you that when you start the school year, right? Spend 2 weeks, whatever the arbitrary number was back in the day, around spend all this time on relationship building and building culture, and then it'll kind of keep you moving well throughout the year and kind of propel things forward. Well, I think the key lesson is that it's ongoing, right? It's something that continues, and you have to do and build and often repair as things evolve too. So I think really bringing educators and all folks on board around the urgency of doing this too, and how necessary it is for young people to succeed, for teachers to feel well, for families to feel well, I think is a critical thing that administrators can really try to focus on as they start the year.
If I could just add on a couple of comments to Laura. I mean, one is I say that there's not just one thing that educators can do. There are multiple parts that need to shift to create that kind of environment. But as you said, this flywheel effect, in each of those domains, it begins somewhere, and teachers can be part of generating that change. If I could just add, I know that sometimes we talk about these things as if they're easy to do. We know that this is that this is difficult work, and that it's ongoing. As some folks I talk to say, there's a difference between the August-September classroom and the May-June classroom, because it takes time for some of these things. It's an ongoing practice. Some of the things we've talked about here, the science of learning and development, how those manifest in a whole child education, and some of the design principles that you need to embed in schools and districts. There's a lot of resources that folks can go to see those in more detail, that Laura's been part of in her work at our organization website, learningpolicyinstitute.org. So I encourage people to see those, and we're also happy to receive inquiries, or if folks want to learn more about the work, happy to share.
We have at the end of this, anything you want to share out of how our listeners can find you, what you want them to go check out, what would be a good follow-up learning experience to this. So please share that now.
I mean, and Dion just directed you all to our organizational website, which has a ton of the research and communiques and blogs. And so we have a lot of communication and research in many forms that folks can kind of dig into as they want. But I do think that I would elevate the design principles for schools, which has its own website, which I should be able to rattle off, but I'll do in a moment as I pull it up. But as this design principles website it puts forth basically an organizing structure for schools in terms of how they can embody and integrate whole child practices. And this spans beyond just relationship centered, which is absolutely part of it, to an entire section dedicated to environments filled with safety and belonging, to rich learning experiences, to social and emotional cognitive development, as well as services. So it runs the gamut in terms of how schools and what structures and practices they might be able to pull into to integrate this into their setting. It's a wealth of knowledge that's research-based. It's also intentionally crafted for practitioners and folks close to the ground to be able to understand what the implications are of science, of how we know young people learn, and what that then looks like in school practice. And so there's probably more than folks would want to dig into, but there's something along that, and there's an accompanying a self-assessment tool that administrators or district leaders can use if they want to step back and see kind of where they are in terms of how they are in terms of the practices and structures. So that's an active tool that folks might be able to use to start their journey. The website that I'm referring to is www.k12.designprinciples.org.
All right. I will put that link in the show description.
Thank you for the invitation to speak with you. Thanks for the thought-provoking topic and the chance to share some of the work that we do. We, as researchers, we get to have these rich experiences, to find out some of the positive practices that are happening, and then to share out some of the things that the people can do in their schools, districts, and on up to the state and federal policy level too. So we like to share that work, and so thanks for the opportunity to do it with you today.
So much. This has been such an interesting conversation.
The Flywheel Effect, harnessing the power of momentum to create a school culture that celebrates change and drives itself.